Nice to meet everyone. I am Bori from Platform C. Briefly about me, I was a junior activist for Platform C until September, and it ended with me coming to Europe. So a year and a half there, and we focus on social movements, internationalism, focusing on East Asia, and I do some work in interpretation and translating from time to time. And I guess this might be categorized as that part of my work. Two pictures are from the final part of August this year. I still haven't come up with an adequate term to describe what it was, but it was kind of like a 4-day workshop where we slept at the Seoul division of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions office and traveled around Seoul in solidarity with various social movements. So first day we had the theme of climate justice, and this is me hosting a rally in front of the building of SK Energy because they were making windfall profits from after the war started in Ukraine, and we were calling for a tax on that. And the second day was various anti-hatred, anti-discrimination. So currently there is a struggle in Seoul's subways for better access for wheelchairs. The third day we did gender cross labor rights, and this was in front of, so Samsung Electronics is an electronics giant in South Korea, and it supposedly has great service, and great service comes with connecting the customer to the service that they require, and that usually involves call centers. But call centers are very subcontracted in South Korea, so the subcontracted workers were laid off, and there was a constant kind of handing out pamphlets in front of the headquarters there. So we were out there in the rain doing that stuff with them, and we held a discussion afterwards. Fourth day it was anti-poverty and rights to the city, or that could be another way to put it. So four themes of that, and that roughly covers the social movements that I would be talking about today as well. So yes, I'll proceed. So the contents, it's nothing much. I'll have a brief preliminary comment and prehistory to the contemporary social movements, various context setting, and then I think we could categorize the current situation of social movements in South Korea roughly as the long 80s, because the conjuncture of 1987 is still very decisive in the conditions set out for today. And then some, I guess, concepts that could be useful in understanding further. And then the introduction to the various contemporary social movements, and then I guess a brief explanation of what Platform C does. So the preliminary remarks is, okay, so I have to read. Is this all right? I think I can do it like this. No, I just want to. Is this all right? Okay. So basically, because of the insularity of South Korea's social movements, which is one of the important reasons why I'm reaching out in Berlin, is that there's little documentation of what kind of discussions happen, of the discussions happening in Korean that is translated into English, so that I expect that people outside of the country and do not speak the language have no idea, find it really, really difficult to access what's going on within the country, what are the primary issues that the social movements are dealing with, and what are the contradictions that they identify, and what are the debates being held, etc. So, yes. So my aim of today's talk and the discussion happening afterward is to provide an entry point in understanding contemporary social movements in South Korea, maybe introduce a couple important actors and organizations, and identify the limitations, challenges, but I don't think I prepared enough for that. And it's necessarily a rough sketch due to this is another condition that South Korean social movements find themselves in. There is no I guess, political party that wedges all of them together into a unified force. So there is a compartmentalization of social movements. You really need to be in the nick of it to really know the depths. And there are very few, I guess, militant activists that know every social movement into its details. So I will be covering only a couple and mentioning a couple maybe notable ones, but I won't be able to cover all of them. So the prehistory is basically, this is the short explanation I put out in the, what do you call it, for the talk. So this was 1922, the Congress for the Toilers of the Far East, which was held after the Washington Naval Conference. And this was, Joseon, Korea was at that time under Japanese colonial rule, and various independence activists were looking for ways to ensure that Korea would become independent once again. And they were primarily because of the Westerns being more or less antithetical to Japan. They thought that, a lot of them thought that the Washington Naval Conference held in dealing with the various interests in the Pacific and East Asia would allow Korea to be independent, but that was quickly that was denied. And a lot of nationalists and a lot of independence fighters then turned to the Soviet Union. And this Congress was held, I think the number of attendants were around 300, and the majority were Korean. And the various nationalities span from China, India, various countries from Southeast Asia, but primarily it was Korea. And so, yes, so this was after the Soviet Union was constructed. And I brought this up as a factoid because I think it's important to indicate that socialism, although it was a major force behind the independence movement, and I constantly try to bring that up because that's not taught in the textbooks. In Korea's education system, the independence movement is just diaspora in Shanghai that set up their own temporary government, and the actual organizing of resisting on the ground, mass movements, holding strikes, tenants movements, they all existed in the Korean peninsula, but they were all leftist. So that has been thoroughly wiped out from the textbooks. But I think it's ironic to note that it's more or less the same in North Korea because not all the factions aligned with Kim Il-sung, and it was a prehistory to that. And it's very hard to explain that the leader became sovereign without going into the factional infighting, and that just rubs out the history there as well. So the socialist, communist, independent side of the independence movement has mostly been marginalized both in North and South of Korea. So I thought that it would be important. I won't get into the knickknacks. I don't really know much of the details, but that's one of the reasons I brought up the prehistory. But after liberation, with Japan's losing the Pacific theater and surrendering to the US, yes, that was after the Second World War in 1948. There was the general elections were held in the southern part of the Korean peninsula, which was at that time being occupied by the US. The North did not hold them, despite being also under the Soviet Union. And there were massive protests all around the country, also in Japan, because there was 7 million Koreans that had been moved to Japan and doing various labors throughout the wartime. And they were about to return to Korea after Japan surrendered, but suddenly there were general elections being held in South Korea. And the Korean War broke out from 1950 to 1953, and throughout the process, the various struggles against the general elections being held led to the Jeju Uprising, April 3rd, that led to the massacre of entire spans of the area. Entire villages were wiped out, and later Yeosu and Suncheon had its own soldier rebellions because they were being sent to Jeju to put down the uprising, and they refused to do so. So there were soldier uprisings in the south as well. And then there were the guerrilla fighters in the Chiri Mountains that were also fighting the South Korean government and its military. And then throughout the Korean War, basically the left was wiped out. And that is the previous story that I wanted to bring up. Despite having a very strong left-wing independence movement, they did not get to see the light of day after liberation because they were sorely wiped out within the left. After the South Korean state was constituted, and its constitution and its National Security Act being brought up at this period, it was basically a dictatorship under Lee Seung-man. Later on, the military dictatorship under Park Chung-hee, and then Chun Doo-hwan. The April 19th revolution was the protest staged against the April 16th presidential elections, where Lee Seung-man secured his rule even further and failed to do so because of these protests. And the various student movements then were more pro-democracy and looking forward to the US as an example of liberal democracy. But I'm jumping a couple decades again to talk about the conjuncture of 1987. And in the 1970s, so from 1950s, the left was wiped out. 1960s, there were student movements, but they were again suppressed under the military dictatorship. And on 1970, November 13th, the 22-year-old Chun Tae-il had committed self-immolation because he was trying to advocate for the labor rights of the women and girls in the garments industry because they were working in horrible conditions, and him as a man had it slightly better, so he was trying to find ways where they could support it. And he found out that the labor law basically did actually lay out basic labor rights for the workers, but they were being ignored constantly. So while committing self-immolation, his slogan was basically just proceed with the labor rights, just guarantee those labor rights. And so this picture on the left-hand side is his monument at the Cheonggye stream, on top of this Cheonggye stream. And this is his mother, who later became a kind of symbol for the labor movement in its early days. And then the far right picture is the National Workers' Rally held annually commemorating his death. And this was a picture from last year, which was in front of the Dongdae Gate. And it was really big because, I guess, I'm kind of muddling it up with my memories here, but anyhow, so in this period, the student movements had initiated worker-student solidarity because Chun Tae-il, while in his diaries, it was just, what people discovered is that labor law was heavily written in Chinese characters, and him not receiving a university education barred him from interpreting the law in a very sort of fashion. So what he wished for was one university friend. And this became such big that a lot of university students sought out solidarity with various workers. So that's the very early form of worker-student solidarity. Lots of students, university students the more radical ones would be reading Narodnik literature and going out to the masses, trying to organize them. But it was done on a more individual fashion. 1980 was when the Gwangju massacre happened. The context for that was 1979, October 26th. The military dictator Park Chung-hee was assassinated by his underling, and various student movements seized an opportunity for change and organized protests for democratization and open elections. But on the same year, December 12th, Chun Doo-hwan went with a coup and secured power for himself. But these protests continued on, but the only city that did keep on to the end was Gwangju, and that was where martial law was declared, and Chun Doo-hwan brought in paratroopers that had fought in the Vietnam War and committed various massacres and brought them upon the citizens of Gwangju, and so committed various massacres there. So this was basically one of the pictures from the rallies back then. And the left's revival came after that moment. So the U.S. had basically authorized, later revealed that the U.S. had let Chun Doo-hwan proceed with proclaiming martial law on the city. And that disillusioned a lot of people's looking up to the U.S. as a model for liberal democracy, and they sought out more radical alternatives. And one of the lessons that they drew from the failure of being able to push through protests and stopping Chun Doo-hwan coming to power was that there was no mass base for it, more or less. It was usually students that were protesting. So, because the events of the Gwangju massacre were very harshly suppressed within South Korea, a lot of student activism was basically telling the truth of Gwangju and throwing out pictures of the massacre that foreign journalists had taken during the massacre, and that's the movie Taxi Driver. What movie Taxi Driver is about?
A Taxi Driver.
A Taxi Driver. Thank you.
Taxi Driver's a different movie.
Yes. The aftermath of the May 18th movement shocked most of the opposition movements in the country, especially the student movement. And the student movement develops new theories and tries to organize the masses. While in the 1970s, students would go into the factories on an individual fashion. In the 80s, you would see students going into the factories in a mass organized fashion. Various factions came up, and they would be going into the factories in the numbers of hundreds, if not thousands in total. So throughout that process, various trade unions were created, and student radical organizations were heavily suppressed. And the conjuncture of 1987 was basically massive protests erupted throughout the country. But before that, there were wildcat strikes happening throughout the summer days. So after that, the white-collar workers started joining the protests, and it became massive enough that I haven't looked into the literature or documentation improper, but in the late 80s, you will see a series of various different East Asian countries achieving liberalization. So South Korea, 1987, 1988, Taiwan ends its martial law period. And the Philippines also saw a series of big democratization movements. So I can't cite proper documentation here, but I would say that pressure from the below had led to the U.S. Pushing for a different strategy, allowing certain limited democratization happening. And that was what you saw in the fall of 1987. Chun Doo-hwan steps down from his dictatorship, allows direct elections to happen, and liberalization in South Korea was achieved. So some rudimentary concepts would be the NLPD divide. The radical student organizations had different theories. On the one hand, you would have the NLs, and the other hand, you would have the PDs. Basically, the NLs were advocating that the primary contradiction within South Korea was the American occupation and the division of the Korean Peninsula. So they would be thinking that national liberation comes first, and you would see this in the presidential elections. A lot of the NL factions gave critical support to the Kim Dae-jung candidate, who later did become president, because he was talking about souring relations with North Korea much more, while the PD factions thought that, yes, national liberation, American occupation, these are all very important problems, but you cannot sideline the class struggle given the level of capitalist development within the country. So within the presidential elections, they had pushed forward for an independent candidate, Baek Gi-won. So that would be a primary division within how to relate to the liberal ideology, how to relate to the state, but also within the national liberation movement, there were particular student activists that had smuggled themselves into North Korea, but with the North Korean Workers' Party, and had received directives and pamphlets, and that had spread through and gained massive popularity within the student movements of the South. And so these organizational ties, although I guess it would be much more harder to see what drives the ideological divide per se, but these organizational ties still affect the various factions within South Korean left. And the workers-student solidarity I brought up. Basically, what I wanted to talk about with this concept is that so the student movements were the primary, I guess, student movements were the primary pushers for the radicalization of social movements in South Korea, to the extent that their relation and building relations with the other mass movements was very important. So I've talked about the 70s and how that changed in the 80s, but basically student organizing is very important, and it trains activists as a basic setup in as a basic training ground. And those student activists would graduate and later on move to the various social movements. That does not necessarily have to be the workers' movement, but also the women's movement and the LGBTQ plus struggles, et cetera, et cetera. Political formation of workers would be, so in South Korea, the basic, I guess, the mainstream theory would be the two wings of the workers' movement. On the one hand, you would have the trade unions organizing democratic trade unions, and on the other hand, you would try to advocate for workers' representation in parliament. And for that end, you would need to create a progressive political party. And it would be very important to have workers be able to gain higher political consciousness for this to happen. So it did happen at a brief moment. The KCTU, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, briefly had the entirety of the left created the Democratic Labor Party in the early 2000s, and it had received the sole support of the KCTU. But after the divisions, as explained earlier, the NLPD divide, organizational divides became quite ugly, and the Democratic Labor Party collapsed, led to various different progressive parties. I think we could roughly count 5 right now that are unable to really unite with. Although I am technically within, I am a card holding member of the Justice Party, I do not have a lot of, it doesn't really look bright what's happening there. So I haven't prepared much about the Progressive Party movements today. Regime of 1987 to 1991 is basically, so the previous president was Moon Jae-in, and then there were 2 other liberal presidents. So currently there is a very solid bipartisanship in South Korea. You would have the conservatives on the one hand and the liberals on the other. And the liberals would always argue I guess you could draw strong parallels with how the U.S. political system works, where the left keeps on having to support the liberals against the conservatives. And the general liberal narrative of 1987 is that liberalization was achieved, and we have to keep those successes against the conservatives. Now, what the reason why I wrote 1991 is, so after that great mobilization in 1987, social movements kept on trying to substantialize the democracy that had only been partially achieved in 1987, and that had seen a very big loss in 1991. And after that moment where the masses no longer supported these protests that kept on advocating for more political democratization, you would see less mobilization happening and the student movement waning after that moment as well. Yes, so I entered university in 2014, and even then the student movement was in a dire state. There was a lot of factional disputes within the student movement, but when I entered university, there were no factions the factions weren't able to reproduce themselves to be able to hold these factionalisms in the first place. And you would see in various student movement documents that they would keep on talking about the crisis of the student movement. And you would see that despite conditions, from my view, being very favorable to the movement. And I've seen for myself those documents going all the way up to 1994, talking about the crisis of the student movement. So that was 2 decades prior. I think you could locate that crisis from 1991. And so it's been a constant decline, and it has reached a point where there are very few factions that we can speak of within the student movement. And although prior to this moment, the student movements would supply the workers' movement with activists, right now the KCTU has recognized that that steady supply is waning, and that there is no guarantee that these activists will keep on coming in that are committed and have a certain level of ideological commitment. So they have turned in the other direction in supporting students in becoming, I guess, labor activists. So the social movement today, so this is the really rough section. I should have focused on this a bit more. The student movement has been unable to really provide an alternative sketch of society after the fall of the Soviet Union, which had affected the South Korean left significantly. So that 1991 moment, you could also see coincides with the fall of the Soviet Union. And a lot of the left had just looked up to the Soviet Union without knowing much about the concrete conditions there. You would see discussions being held in Korean about the perestroika, et cetera. But after it collapsed, a large portion of the left gave up on trying to build an alternative, became liberals. A lot of the students, ex-students, activists that had moved into the factories returned to getting stable jobs and gave up on organizing altogether. And there was also a destruction, I guess destruction is a strong word, but on the inability to reproduce its organizational structures. And the two primary organizational structures in South Korea would be the student union body, and the various clubs. And these came out from the underground clubs from the 80s, but a lot of them still retain those organizational structures with inertia. So so the student union would provide contact with the various factions with the student masses, but because those student unions have shrunken in significant sizes, the activists themselves have lost a lot of contact with the student masses, leading to their denigration or organizational collapse altogether. And so I guess I can move on from that. So the student movement is in a very rough state right now. The workers' movement, so I've mentioned the KCTU, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which is the national center, as it is the confederation. It is further divided into the industrial unions, the KPTU, the Korean Public Workers Trade Union, the MWTU, the Metal Workers Trade Union, and various others, but the two I mentioned here are the largest. And on the one hand, you have the industrial unions. On the other hand, you will have the various local centers. So South Korea is divided into the various metropolitan cities, Seoul being the capital, Busan on the southeast coast of the peninsula is the second largest city, and then there would be, I'm kind of not remembering the exact number, but a couple other big cities like that, Ulsan, Gwangju, Daejeon, Daegu, etc., and then the various 7 provinces from Gyeonggi-do, Incheon, Gangwon-do, the Gyeongsang-do provinces, Chungcheong-do provinces, and the Jeollado provinces. And the KCT would have local centers in each of those provinces, and sometimes with other major cities within those provinces as well. Feminism, I guess I wanted to mention because in 2016 there was a femicide, what can only be characterized as a femicide in the subway station of Gangnam, and it kind of brought up a mass consciousness rising. So before that, feminism was really delegated to the margins of the university for I guess roughly 1 or 2 decades. There was the young women's movement that had appeared in the late 90s that really talked about the male chauvinism within the various social movements, and they had to organize themselves in that fashion, but it had faced significant backlash after that. It was marginalized for 2 decades until 2016, where there was large students that had no prior contact with various activists would on their own accord start organizing book clubs, organizing rallies, and this was one of the more significant results of that. It was in the around Haehwa station in the northeast part of Seoul, where women came to protest against the digital sexual violence that is prevalent in South Korea. I wanted to mention a couple other organizations. So on the top you would have SHARE. So abortion has been effectively decriminalized in South Korea since 2020, but the Ministry of Health is not doing its job in providing like the institutional framework to guarantee the rights of reproduction. So SHARE puts out materials in English as well, statements from time to time, although it primarily focuses on putting out newsletters in Korean. But it's basically, I forgot what the acronym stands for, but reproductive justice, and it's a network of that. There is the Korean Women Workers Association, and then the big Association of Women's Organizations, and then as the big wave of feminism in the late 90s was organized against male chauvinism, there was a big anti-sexual violence campaign and various organizations that came out from that. So that's on the one hand. Climate justice, I think, is a very exciting recent development. There is a longer history of a green movement of environmentalism in South Korea, but it was usually, on the one hand, organized on single issues, like if the government is planning to set up a dam somewhere or set up electric transfer infrastructure that had to do with that destroyed the livelihoods of the people staying there, there would be mass local movements organized around that issue. But the Climate Justice Alliance was launched in April of this year after there was a need recognized that the liberal advocacy kind of NGOs had been thoroughly absorbed into the previous liberal administration. And on the 26th, last month, there were 45,000 people mobilized in the middle of Seoul and went on with the climate justice march. And the picture I have here that's really small and hard to see is like our attempts in reaching out to various other countries in East Asia, telling them that we are holding a climate justice march, and we ask for, I guess, various statements of solidarity. But the reason I find it very exciting is the first move that the Climate Justice Alliance made was going out to support the subcontracted workers in the coal plants that are outside of Seoul, because the previous liberal administration has made a promise to be carbon neutral by 2050, coal plants are in the process of being shut down. But the subcontracted workers who do the various manual work in setting up the coal plants and managing it, they are all being subcontracted and are not directly employed by the plants themselves, and they are finding very hard time in finding other jobs after that. And if that wasn't reached out, which the labor movement itself was unable to do so, then the bourgeois press or the state could have driven the wage between, I guess, middle class environmentalists, good doers, and the workers who are fighting for their livelihoods. But that was the first move that the Climate Justice Alliance had made. And there are further attempts in building bridges with the farmers movement, which I'm not going to be able to talk about today, but has been at the forefront of the various, I guess, anti-neoliberal struggles of the early 2000s, and has massive base and is quite militant. Things other worth mentioning, at the beginning of the talk, I talked about the disability rights organization and the anti-poverty organizations and the progressive party movements. I guess I could also mention the LGBTQ plus struggles and the farmers movement, etc. So Platform C, I guess I'm going into a section that requires a significant amount of time, but how much time have I used up? Maybe
you've been
50 minutes, 40 minutes in.
40 minutes, so 10 more minutes?
Yes, I think I can wrap it up within that time. So Platform C, I hope that I've roughly covered the various conditions of South Korean social movements. And it's a very young org that started out in 2019. Currently has less than 300 members, and it drew lessons from previous left groupings. So it's very hard to explain what exactly it is, because there is no like explicit ideological objective that has been written out in some form. But I've talked to the seniors there, and they said that the three goals that I've outlined here seems to be more or less in line with what Platform C aims to do. The first one is creating new pathways for people to become activists. The reason I brought up the worker-student solidarity is because that is basically where a lot of activists first learn how to engage in solidarity in the first place. But with the student movement declining, those pathways have been cut off. So I guess one way of becoming an activist is going to rallies, attending book discussions, and a lot of drinking, where seniors would sternly tell, I guess, their juniors about what is acceptable or not, what it means to be part of the movement, what it means to be a good activist, etc., etc. being individual and being cut off from those pathways means that it's very hard to find a way to be disciplined in when in the sense of when we talk about being disciplined. The second is I've talked about the NLPD divide that is still affecting various social movements. The workers' movement within the KCTU, there are the NLs, there are the PDs, roughly 50-50, making it like there is separation of powers. But also the progressive parties have divided into like currently 5 different parties that are unable to agree on a lot of things. But in the early 2000s, there was, with the influence of the World Social Forum and the anti-WTO protests, the excitement that came out from there affected domestic movements as well. So because all activists spanning from ideological divide sent their activists abroad and to attend those various movements, that also came back domestically, and there was a broad anti-neoliberal front that was built for a couple of years. There was a national people's front, and all the social movements basically had membership in that front. And what that created was a more or less shared and intelligible assessments of the conjuncture. So there would be a difference in emphasis on maybe the division of the Korean Peninsula, American occupation, Korean capital, screwing with workers, etc. But there was a shared common horizon that we needed to work together to do that. After the collapse of that front, it has been a series of compartmentalizations, not just of the various social movements, but within the various factions themselves. They don't talk to each other, they don't discuss with each other, they don't work with each other. So trying to create a broad united front is a second thing. And the third is, I've talked about the insularity of South Korean social movements. So we are trying to reach out. Usually the way leftist discourse works is that foreign, I guess, abroad, social movements, parties, their examples are brought in as examples to implement. There are not a lot of horizontal organic relationships built with other social movements, and usually those examples are brought in from Europe or North America, or I guess Australia being another place. So we don't have a lot of knowledge. There is no regular discussions of, like, say, the democratic movements in Thailand, or the struggle against the junta in Myanmar, or et cetera, et cetera. Like, what is the labor struggle? What is the current labor struggle like in Indonesia? These are not topics brought up regularly, and that does severely limit our perspectives on what is possible or not. So trying to build East Asian international solidarity would be the third goal of Platform C. And looking into the third goal, because we are talking about South Korea in the context of Berlin, this is the monthly newsletter Eastern Movements. We cover various social movements in East Asia, which includes the following countries. So there is no, so we've not developed to the extent that we have activists within the various countries that report and send like news or discussions that we translate into Korean. It's all people in South Korea looking into the news, trying to find something that might be worth sharing, et cetera, et cetera. But that, I guess, would be a longer term goal. I think I've been able to build ties earlier last month, but we'll see how that develops, and perhaps ties built with my stay here in Berlin might contribute to that as well. We are also writing a pamphlet on East Asian internationalism that will be published hopefully by the end of this year, and next year we will try to translate that into various languages. I might be in charge of translating into English. This pamphlet writing was the result of a study group on China that went on for a couple of years. I only joined it starting last year, but that's where it comes from. and it will talk about various issues, uncovering the various historical international struggles. It will have a topic on the theoretical framework of how this internationalism might work. It will bring up various historical examples and concurrent examples of internationalisms that exist and try to, it would be written for a primarily Korean audience, but hopefully it will garner some discussion when it gets translated. Other efforts, aside from Platform C of building internationalism in South Korea, is one of the most important ones is the Migrant Workers Trade Union. And they also organize migrant women, whom a lot of them come to Korea to marry Korean men. And there is almost, I think we could speak of an industry that connects, Vietnamese women, Filipino women, and connect them to Korean men, usually in the countryside. A lot of farmers in their 40s, 50s. There's a population drain from the countryside to the cities, and a lot of single men look for wives in Southeast Asia. So obviously there is not a lot of social support or state support for these women, and organizing them is also very important. The KCT has an annual Asian Trade Union Activist Workshop that invites activists from all across East Asia for a week of discussion and reports of the state of the various workers' movements. And there are various civil society organizations that work in solidarity with various international issues. So Palestine Liberation Solidarity is one organization that focuses on Palestine, but there still is, if I recall correctly, a network that is in solidarity with the struggle in Myanmar. There was one for Peace for Ukraine, and then currently the Hong Kong democracy movement has been sorely wiped out, would be one way to put it. But when it was in its heyday in 2019, there was a lot of solidarity for that as well. And some resources here that I might share. I don't know if I've sent Phil these links before, but that concludes the talk. Thank you.